What's up and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be doing a book review. I know I've not done one of them in a very long time. We were doing the entire Stephen King bibliography and I'm still doing it. It's just taking me such a long time to catch up. I took a long break from reading. The last one I read was Eyes of the Dragon, I believe, but we are back with the next one up in the list, which is a fan favorite. Now this is Misery. Before we get into the review, I want to show you my copy of this book. This one remains unread. I don't think I'll ever read it just because how stunning it is, but this is like the collector's edition hardback that I got for maybe Christmas or a birthday a couple of years back, and it's intact. It stays in its little bookcase, and I don't think I'll ever read it just because it's so amazing as a cover, but this is the version that I have read. So this one I can mess up those pages, I don't mind. This is the version I read. So this was published in 1987. It was adapted into a movie in 1990, I believe, and then there was even a play much later down the line, 2015, with Bruce Willis. I think I've never seen that. I don't know anything about it, but today we're going to be talking about the novel version here. So this was right off the back of The Eyes of the Dragon, which was a story which was more of a fantasy. It was King's first breakaway from horror, really, and it's really reflected in this book, and I'll tell you about that when we get into the plot. Originally this was actually supposed to be written as a Richard Bachman book, but I think he was outed previous to this about his real identity, so it became a Stephen King book. Really curious to see how it would have done as a Richard Bachman book, because this is a great book and it would really parallel Stephen King as a writer with the plot as well if it was sort of like a pseudonym. So Misery, this follows the story of Paul Sheldon, a writer who goes up into the mountains of Colorado, a sidewinder I believe. He's in a cabin, he's writing his new novel in the Misery series, a franchise he's been working on for his entire career basically. His main focus has been the character of Misery, Chastain I believe she's called. It's more of a romantic novel series, and he feels like he's tied to this series, much like Stephen King feels like he's probably tied to writing horror books, so there's lots of parallels there. But Paul Sheldon has come to the conclusion that he is finished with his character of Misery. Now he wants to write his final book in the series and kill her off. With Paul being up there in this cabin, he tends to be drinking a lot, and he decides to drive and celebrate after finishing the book, to drive home I guess, or drive back to New York or wherever he's heading, and he ends up in a automobile crash which wrecks his body. He passes out and wakes up in someone else's house. Now this is the house of Annie Wilkes, someone who is taking care of him while he is being mended back together. His bones are broken, he is in a very bad state, he's lucky he's alive. And just under the circumstances, it seems out of coincidence that Annie Wilkes is actually Misery, the book series' biggest fan. She's an absolute mega fan of Paul Sheldon, so you would have thought this could be a recipe for maybe something good. She's going to take extra care of him, or is this a super obsessive fan? So with Annie Wilkes being a mega fan of the Misery series and the character of Misery Chastain, when she discovers that Paul is writing the final book, she wants to read it and she isn't happy with the results, and this changes Annie Wilkes' character towards Paul in many different ways throughout the story. And this is more of a held captive story. Like, you guys have seen the movie, come on, you guys probably know about this one already. If you haven't, then go and read this book, because you want to go in blind really if you've not seen anything before. But essentially this is the story of Paul Sheldon trying to survive from his wounds and also from the effects of Annie Wilkes and her mood swings. It's very similar to the film actually. There is a lot of changes towards the end of the book, but for the most part the spirit and the theming isn't intact in the movie version. So the character of Annie Wilkes is a very complex and interesting one. We can see why Kathy Bates won an award for her performance as Annie in the movie, not only because of her acting prowess, but for the fact that the character she's playing is so unpredictable and you have no idea whether you should be trusting what she's doing or expecting something bad to happen. And this plays out even more so in the book. It's so unpredictable, and that's what makes it such a good read, because you have no idea what kind of mind state Annie is in. She can just flip a switch and be an absolute maniac at some times, and then the other time she's being really nice. So you're put in this situation as Paul, who has no idea what's going to happen every time she enters the room. He's always on edge, he's always having a feeling of dread. He has no idea what she's actually capable of. You do find this out more as the book progresses, as Paul finds out more about Annie herself. Paul is also complex as well, and it actually goes into sort of like a meta thing. It's weird in a way how this book seems more important now than it did back then, because there's so many themes of like imposter syndrome and fan reactions to the media, which is like really relevant right now. The amount of times that something comes out and actually gets torn to pieces by the public with social media and stuff like that, and the fans wanting what they want, and the artist is just giving them what they want to write, and sometimes fans aren't happy with that, and they really reflect on that in this book. And it's really interesting actually from both sides of the story, because you have Paul writing these drafts of the book Misery's Return, because he has to write a book that Annie would be worthy of, and every time he has to show her transcripts of this story, you have no idea what's going to happen, if she's going to like the story or not. And I guess this is what most artists go through when they're creating art. It's this feeling of they have trust in what they're doing themselves, but they have no idea what everyone else is going to think about it, and they're probably a little bit scared to release it out into the world. And then on the other side of that, we see scenes where Paul is writing scripts and he actually gets feedback from Annie, which is actually helpful to him. And it actually gives Paul a bit of an ego check at times when he's thinking, actually, yeah, you know what, she's actually right about that. This makes more sense. And it also gives the reader a lot of information about how a story is put together and the plot points and different things within the construct of a story. And it's incredible to read, not only as a thriller horror book, but as a piece of educational material to write a book about how it's done, especially when it's coming from Stephen King. There are some changes with some of the bigger moments that we see in the movie, and I will say that the book version of events is a lot more brutal than what we see in the film in many different ways. And it's just, yeah, this was one where the finale definitely did not disappoint. Stephen King's books tend to go kind of a bit crazy towards the end of the story, and this one I feel like they really follow through with a full narrative arc here that like really nailed it in the end. This is all off the back of my head. I actually finished this maybe 2 or 3 months ago, so I'm just reflecting on my memory of the book and maybe just a few excerpts online just to remember some of the key scenes. But it stuck with me, some of these massive scenes in the book, which are just absolutely brutal. If you like stories or films where people are kind of trapped somewhere and they have to figure out their own ways of getting through it, then this is one for you as well, because we get to see Paul recovering really slowly and trying to figure out how to get out of the situation as his strength starts to come back, and how he can do different things in trying to escape the house. And it's just a roller coaster ride of a book. Another interesting factor about the book as well is the fact that King kind of used Annie Wilkes' character as a metaphor for his substance abuse when he was taking a lot of cocaine back then, and he kind of used her character as a metaphor for that, for like the bittersweetness of it. Sometimes it's really good, and then sometimes, you know, it's not so good, and the whole back and forth of ups and downs between the substance abuse, he kind of put that into a character form. It was unpredictable, so I love the way he did that. Not like I have any experience with that myself, but for those who might have it, it might bring an extra little thematic tone for them. There's always an interesting thing when you're reading a new Stephen King book, especially in the early ones, as you're going through his first bits of work, how he tries to add little different things to the storytelling in each book, whether it's through Carrie having sort of these documents, or in certain books where they have just different types of telling the story. In Misery, Paul Sheldon is using an old Royal typewriter, and he uses this every time he writes news, transcripts and pages for the stories he's writing in the book, such as Misery's Return. And the letter N falls off this one, and you can see that in each of the transcripts, because there's either no N's at the start, or he actually gets Annie to start filling them out with like a pen herself individually. So every time you're reading one of these transcripts, you can see these bold N's that have been added in the text in the book, and it's just a nice little extra touch in it. It's an extra creative flair, which I think I love seeing the different ways that he changes out the storytelling in the books. And as the story progresses and more keys sort of go haywire, we see more of the transcripts become more muddled and differently written. So another little awesome aspect I love about Stephen King's books. So I would definitely recommend reading this book if you've seen the movie, or if you haven't, because I've seen the movie a million times and this book added to it, so it wasn't like, oh, I was reading page for page the same thing and I was bored. No, this was a great read. So hope you guys have enjoyed this review. I will be back with another one whenever I finish the next Stephen King book. I'm currently reading the Tommyknockers, which is quite a long one, so we're going to see what happens there. Hopefully you guys see a video within the next 6 months or so. But yeah, thanks guys for watching. Let me know down below in the comments section, and I will be back with more content very soon.